Hey, if you have your Bible with you tonight, let me see it. Let me see it. Where's your Bible? Put it up in the air. That's not a Bible, Luke. That's a skateboard. Hey, this section's doing pretty good over here. Lots of Bibles, a couple in the middle. Hey, it would be literally my absolute favorite gift ever, dream come true of all time, if like once I asked that question and every hand went up. Because this right here, let me tell you what, I've had a couple super awesome mentor figures in my life. One of them being my dad. One of them being Derek Gear, who you guys should know. He's the director of Meadow Ranch. So the guy who comes up and he kind of looks like me, taller guy, wears a hat all the time, and he gives kind of the rules and stuff at camp and is the one who runs it all in Meadow. If you guys been to Hume, both of those guys, Derek and my dad, and one of the biggest advices that they've given me among other men in my life that I really, really respect is to dive into this book right here as much as you possibly can. And if you hear one thing this year, if you hear just one thing from this entire year, I get up here every week, sometimes twice a week if you come on Sundays, or you've heard Luke Theck speak, or you've heard some other people, Brandon, come in here. If you take away one thing this year, it's the importance of this book. And that everything we do here on Tuesday nights, everything from the games to the worship, everything is based out of this book, because it's a story that's told from Genesis to Revelation of a God that created you and me and who loved us enough to send his son to die for us and to raise again so that we can have life in him. And I just wanted to start with that tonight, just really thinking about this story, really thinking about this book and the importance of this. And I love that some of you bring it here. I love that some of you have your own copy with the pages rifled through. And I'm sure there's others of you that maybe don't have a Bible or have a Bible and it just kind of sits on your shelf. And I want to tell you, man, there's nothing that I can tell you from up here that's more important than to dive into this book and to ask questions about it. So find that person that you can ask questions to in your life, whether it's your hub group leader, maybe your parent, maybe a friend, maybe a teacher. I know you have teachers on campus that care about you and that care about God's word. So dive into this book, okay? What are we talking about right now? Last 2 weeks, what have we been talking about? Cheaters. All right, does anybody remember what we talked about last week? Okay, yeah, he told the story of Moses with the rock in the Old Testament and that rock being Jesus. Yeah, Brandon kind of laid out the gospel last week a little bit. Anything else? Anybody remember any other stories last week that were told? Or anything from last week? What about the week before that? 2 weeks ago. Okay, definitely talked about Israel. Back up a little bit, though. What did we talk about? Okay, we talked about the presence of God being there, being visible with the pillar of smoke and with the pillar of fire. Okay, 2 weeks ago, where did we start this story? The people of Israel, they were somewhere. Where were they? Egypt. Okay, and what were they doing in Egypt? Yeah, you raise your hand? Okay, yeah, I jumped forward a little bit. They did do that. When they were in Egypt, what happened? Okay, they were slaves, and there were 10 what? Plagues, right? There were 10 plagues, and these things happened, and Moses was coming, and he kept asking Pharaoh to let his people go, right? He came coming and said, let my people go, and over again, Pharaoh said no, and then these plagues happened, these gnarly things that we went through. There were like frogs and flies, and water turned to blood, and all these things. And then they were led across the Red Sea. They walked across the Red Sea, and then there were a couple of times where God showed up to them, right? First, beforehand, there was the pillar of cloud, there's the pillar of fire that they were leading, then they were led through the Red Sea, and then there were multiple moments that we talked about where God clearly showed up to them, right? Boys, pay attention. There were multiple times where God showed up to them, right? There were these moments where the first one I want to talk about is when the celebration of the Passover feast. Okay, so before they crossed the Red Sea, the very last plague, remember we talked about kind of the sadness of it, that God said every firstborn son of Egypt will be killed. But before he said that, he looked at the people of Israel and he said, if you kill a lamb and you take its blood and you put it over your doorpost, the angel of death will come and it will pass over your home. Okay, and this was the first Passover. This was the first moment where God delivered the people of Israel from death. Okay, the angel of the Lord came and it killed the firstborn as the last plague, as the last thing, because Egypt would not let God's people go. Okay, and this Passover became something that Israel celebrated every single year to remember God's provision for them, that God led them out of Egypt. The second one was the naming of a place called Marah. And do you remember the people of Israel? They were thirsty after they had crossed the Red Sea, after they had seen God do all of these amazing things. They came to this place and they were like grumbling and complaining to Moses. And they were like, man, we're thirsty. Give us something to drink. Like, why'd you bring us out here in the desert? Was it just to kill us? Like, we had water in Egypt. We had all this like posh stuff in Egypt. Why did you bring us out here? Was it to kill us? And they came to this place and there was water, but it was bitter. Right? And the water was bitter, and they said, we can't drink this water, we're going to die. And they were grumbling and they were complaining, even though God had shown up to them over and over and over again. And Moses, given the power by God, turned the water from bitter to sweet so that the people of Israel could drink it. Yet another time that God showed up for his people, that he delivered them, that they had an experience with God. So he said, let us name this place Marah, which meant bitter, so that every time somebody crosses this place and they say, Marah, bitterness, why is this place called bitter? The story could be told of God showing up for his people. The story could be told of God providing for his people so that they would remember this moment. Another time, there was manna, right? Do you remember the people of Israel were hungry? So first they were thirsty, now they're hungry. And they look at Moses and they say, Moses, again, why did you bring us out here? Why did you deliver us out here? Was it so you could kill us? We had food in Egypt. And reading this story, that's kind of why we named it Stupid Israelites, is you look at the people of Israel and they become incredibly frustrating. They're like, are you kidding me, people of Israel? God led you by a pillar of smoke, this tornado leading them. That is God. He's leading you, right? Brandon showed you last week, he had the tent up here and the fog coming up out of it, that they saw God, they experienced God. He had fire. He split the Red Sea so that they could walk through it. He gave them water, and now they come and they're like, we're hungry, man. Give us food. Did you bring us out here to kill us? And they complain and they grumble against God again, and God provides them with what? Manna. And God gives them enough manna, which was like this bread that kind of rained from the sky. Every morning it rained so that they would gather what they needed for the day, and they would eat enough to be filled. And God gave Moses very specific instructions. And he said, grab a jar, take some manna off the ground, put it in the jar, close the jar, so that every time somebody looks at that jar and says, hey, what happened? Why do you guys have that jar? And they can say, oh, this jar right here, this reminds us of God's provision for us. This reminds us that we had this experience with God, that God showed up for us. And God very specifically said, set up these reminders because I know my people will forget me, which they did again and again and again. There was another time where they came across another time where they were thirsty again. And they show up and they come, and this was the first time, not the time where Moses hit the rock and disobeyed God, but this was the first time that Moses hit the rock, and he hit a rock with his staff. Water came out of it, provided for his people. They named it Massa and Meribah. And they said, this place, remember this place. They gave it a very specific name so that people would remember that God provided for them. You catching the theme here? People of Israel forget God. God sets up these reminders for them to remember. The last one, do you remember the story where the people of Israel came into their first battle, right? And Joshua led the people down in the valley, and there was the two friends of Moses held his arms up so that every time he held the staff in the air, the people of Israel were successful. People of Israel were winning the battle. When he got tired, he dropped his arm down, and the staff came down, and the people would lose in the valley. Do you remember that story? From week 1, we told that story. Afterward, after Israel was victorious in the battle, God had them set up this altar. And the altar, he said, the Lord is my banner. That's what he called the altar. And so that every time somebody walked by this altar, walked by this thing that they set up, they would remember God's victory in that battle. Because the people would go and they would forget God, like you and me do so often, right? The Israelites would forget God despite their amazing experiences with him. In the first 2 weeks, we've kind of gone through the story of Israel, and we've told a little bit, and we've told some stories, and it's fun hearing the story of the Old Testament, but you have to ask the question, why did God give us these stories? Why did God give us the Bible, and not just the New Testament, not just the part about Jesus, but he gave us an entire Old Testament as well? And I think it's to better understand who God is, and better understand his character, and understand why he created us, and why he treated the people like he did. Why he set up these rules, why he set up the covenants, why he set up these things that forced the people to remember. And I think an element of God's character is that he loves us enough to know that we're going to walk away from him. He loves us enough to know that I'm going to commit my life to him, I'm going to make this decision, but there's going to be times where I'm not really feeling it. I don't really understand where God's at. There's going to be times in my life where, like the Israelites, they forget what God did for them. Like the Israelites did time and time and time again, there are times that you and I forget. Right? If you're anything like me, you've heard the gospel 100 times, maybe 150 times, maybe 1,000 times, I don't know. You've heard this story that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall have eternal life. There's some of you in this room that could quote that. You could tell me where that is in the Bible. You could tell me all the stories. Some of you in this room that are pretty new to that. But either way, at one point or another, a lot of us have made a decision to follow Jesus. We talk about being a disciple of Jesus. A lot of you have said, that's something I want to do. And if you haven't made that decision yet, I hope that by coming here to ABC, that's something you come to, is a desire to follow Jesus. But whatever side you're on in that, there's times that we forget. And I love seeing that God provides these things so that Israel will remember over and over and over again. One of my favorite one of these is the crossing of the Jordan. So just a broad scope history. You take Israel, they're in Egypt for 400 plus years. Then there's the 10 plagues. They come out of Egypt. And then there's this journey from Egypt to the promised land. So you back up all the way to the book of Genesis, right? In the very beginning, God created everything. And then comes along Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abraham. And he says, I'm going to bring your people. I'm going to make a nation out of you. And I'm going to bring them to the promised land. In Egypt, I'll bet you anything the people of Israel looked back on that covenant, back on that promise that God made with Abraham, and they were like, where the heck is that promise, God? We're slaves right now. Like, life sucks. Life is hard. Why are we in Egypt? This is horrible. We're slaves. That, at one point Pharaoh kills all of the boys of the Israelite people. They're under oppression. Life is not very fun for them. Okay, comes Moses. Moses comes along. He delivers the people of Egypt out of Egypt. He delivers the Israelites out of Egypt. They're wandering in the desert, cross the Red Sea. All of these things happen, I just say, and then they finally come to the Jordan. Okay, that's where we're at. Come out of Egypt, cross the Red Sea, walked for a while. A couple weeks have passed. They come to the Jordan. They finally see the promised land. This is hundreds of years in the making. Finally, they get to the place where they can kind of start to see, like, that's the promised land out there. There's a little bit of green. We can see it. And they get to this point, and they decide that they're going to send out 12 spies. They send out 12 spies to kind of go scope it out, check it out. And in this point, they send out these spies, and they go out for 40 days. And they're looking around, and they see this land. And they're like, oh, it's good. It's good. And there's even this one point that I love in the story where they say they grabbed a pole between two men. So if you imagine like a pretty big pole, and they carried one cluster of grapes on that pole from the promised land. It sound like some pretty massive grapes, right? My mom used to always pack my lunch when I was in elementary school, and she would give me like a little bit of fruit, like a well-balanced meal. I imagine if it was those grapes, she'd just be like, here's your one grape, son. You'd be like, thanks, Mom. this giant grape. They were that type of grapes, right? Between a pole, two men. That's the type of land this was. It was prospering. It says it was a land flowing with milk and honey. There were orchards. There was plenty of food, plenty of water. And if you can remember in this story, these people since Egypt have been eating manna. They've been wandering around and they're like, man, they're always complaining about water, always complaining about food. They finally get to this land. They look and they see, man, there's food, there's water, there's vineyards, there's fruit, there's everything. But here's the thing. 10 of them, 10 out of the 12, get freaked out by the guys that are occupying this land. There's a group of people, and there's some speculation as to who they are, but he said they were these giant people, and that they were super strong and really big, and they were really intimidating, and 10 out of the 12 guys said, if we go in there, we're going to die. If we go into this land that God has promised us, they're going to kill us. Look how giant those guys are. Look how strong they are. For me, I grew up playing sports. I played basketball, I played soccer, and I played volleyball when I was in high school. And there were times where, as a younger high schooler, we would walk into the gym and we would see the other team and be like, are you kidding me? Like, those are the guys we're playing? Like, that dude has a beard. We're in 8th grade. Like, I don't even have armpit hair yet. Right? That was the type of thing that, like, every once in a while we'd walk into the gym and there would be these teams where it'd be like, can we get like a birth certificate on that guy? Or like, these guys are massive and yet we have to play them. I can imagine how the Israel's feeling at this point. That these 10 guys look at it and they're like, we're going to die. We're going to die if we go in there. But 12 minus 10 is 2. There's these 2 dudes, Joshua and Caleb. And these guys are awesome. I love these guys in the story because Joshua and Caleb, they look at the other 10 and they're like, guys, are you joking? Like, we have God on our side. Like, those guys are nothing compared to God. Like, were you listening to the stories that our fathers and our grandfathers told us? Did you not know that God delivered us out of Egypt? Did you not know that God did the 10 plagues? Were you not there when God provided manna when we were hungry? Moses hit that rock, water come out. There was like that pillar of fire and that pillar of cloud. Like, hello, wake up. God is on our side. Those giants, those guys, they're nothing compared to God. And they come back and they give this report, and Joshua and Caleb are trying to tell everybody, they're like, hey, we can do this. God's on our side. Like, we can win this, no problem. And the other 10 are like, dude, forget these guys. And they go all the way to the point where they're like, hey, we're going to stone these guys. We're going to kill them, and we're going to elect ourselves a new leader, and we're going to go back to Egypt. Psycho, right? They get to this point where they're too intimidated to enter into the land that God has promised them. They're too afraid because their emotions took over, their feelings took over. When they saw what was before them, they said, there's no way we can do this. But 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, stayed faithful, and they said, despite the circumstances, despite my fears, despite what looks intimidating, despite what's going on in the here and now, I know what's true. And I can hold on to what's true. Maybe life's hard right now. Maybe whatever's looking out there is tough. Maybe it looks impossible even, but I know that God is on my side. And I love that God looks at these guys and he rewards them for their faithfulness. And everybody else, he says, you guys aren't even going to see the promised land. And he says, everyone over 20 years of age will not see the promised land. Why? Because they spent 40 years in the desert from that point. And he said, because of your unfaithfulness, very similarly to when they worshiped that golden calf. When God shows up on the mountain and then they forget about it and then they worship this calf and then God punishes his people. Very similarly, in this moment, God says, now you will spend 40 years in the desert. And all of you, except the 2 of you, Joshua and Caleb, none of you will see the promised land. And he takes the next generation of people and he brings them 40 years later to the edge of the Jordan. There's this river that separates them from the wilderness or the desert where they were and the promised land. And this is where we're going to pick up the story today. And I love this part of the story because this is 40 years later, 40 years removed from the Red Sea. All of those guys that crossed the Red Sea, most of them are dead now. And you got this younger generation. And this younger generation goes and they come up to the Jordan River, and God gives them very specific instructions. It says the Ark of the Covenant, one of those things that was in that diagram that Brandon showed you last week. He said the Ark of the Covenant, you're going to pick 12 priests. And these 12 priests are going to take the Ark of the Covenant, and they're going to walk across the Jordan River. And when they touch the Jordan River, it will dry up on either side. And again, the people of Israel experience God in an incredible way. And the Ark of the Covenant goes with these 12 guys. The river walls up. An amazing thing. Again, if there's a DVD player in heaven, I want to see this moment. The river walls up, and all of Israel walks across dry land. All of Israel crosses the Jordan River into the promised land, where they will soon conquer the promised land and be given something by God. But I love that God says this. God says, hey, when you're crossing the river, those 12 guys that are holding the Ark of the Covenant, which signifies my presence with you, when you're there, pick up 12 stones. And take those 12 stones, and on the other side of the river, make this altar for me. And this is where we pick it up in Joshua chapter 4, verses 20. It says, and those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. Verse 21, and he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. And I love, again, God gives them this memory. He gives them this thing to remember what he's done for them. And he says, hey, when your kids come up to you and they yank on your shirt and they're like, Daddy, what are those 12 stones for? He says, at that moment, take your sons, take your daughters, sit them down, and tell them the story of what I did for you. Tell them about the time that you brought us out of Egypt. Tell them about the time that you painted blood over your doorposts and your kids were saved. Tell them about the time where Moses struck the rock and water come out. Tell them about the time where I fed you, I gave you manna, I gave you quail. Tell them about the time where God's presence was with you over and over and over and over again. And God sets this up for them so that the people will remember. One of my favorite passages about remembering is Deuteronomy 6. In the first part of this, it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. That's something you guys have heard a lot. That's something Jesus quotes in the New Testament. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Basically, he gives them a command. He says, love God with everything you are, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And then he says, take that and write it everywhere. Write it on your doorposts. He says, teach it to your children. Put it on the frontlets of your eyes. Do everything you can to remember that. And then he goes on in verse 10, and in here he's going to reference that promised land that we just talked about. And it says, and when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. Basically, God's saying here, when you come into the promised land, when you cross the Jordan River, after you set up those 12 stones, when you walk into this land flowing with milk and honey, with giant grapes, when you're living in these posh houses, when you're eating food that's not yours, when you're reaping the fruit of fields that you did not plant, when you take all of this, do not forget me. Do not forget me. He says, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God gives them this very, very specific command. He says, when you were in hardship, when everything was tough, you cried out to me over and over and over again. And what did I do? I showed up. But in the promised land, when everything's going well, Don't forget me. And that's challenging, man. That is incredibly challenging for me because there are times in my life where I know that God was there. There are times in my life when, I'm sick or somebody in my family is sick or there's something hard going on or I got to pass a test that I didn't study for or I'm cold or I'm hungry or there's all these things going on. Man, it's easy for me to cry out to God in those moments. I'm like, God, you got to help me pass this test, man. Or God, like, help my aunt. She's sick. Like, she has this. Like, God, and it's really easy to remember God in those moments. But man, when everything's going my way, when everything's kind of good and I'm just coasting, when there's plenty of food in the fridge, when mom and dad both have good jobs, I don't really need God in those moments, do I? God's saying, whoa, 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 in those moments when you have all of these gifts that I gave you, don't forget me. And I love that God sets up all of these things over and over and over and over again in the people of Israel's lives to say, remember me. When you walk by these things, remember me. Fast forward to Jesus' time. Right before Jesus walked to the cross, right before he was about to be crucified, he goes up into the upper room with his disciples, with his guys, he's with his 12 guys. And he has this thing called the Last Supper. And if you've ever been in a church service where they pass around a little cracker and a little thing of grape juice, it goes all the way back to this room. It's called the upper room. Jesus is hanging out with 12 of his disciples, and Jesus knows that he's about to walk to his death. Jesus knows that he's about to be betrayed by Judas, that he's about to walk, and he's going to be beaten, he's going to be nailed to a cross, and he's going to be killed. He knows this. Jesus at this point knows that he is going to die for the sins of the world. And not only is he going to die a physically painful death, but all the sins of the world are going to be put on him, and his own Father is going to turn his back on him because God cannot be a part of sin. And knowing all of this, knowing that out of love, he is willingly walking to the cross. With this in his mind, he looks at the guys that he loves. He looks at the disciples. He looks at them, he says, I know you're going to forget this. I know you're going to forget all the times we hung out. I know you're going to forget all the miracles I performed. I haven't died yet. I haven't risen from the dead yet. But when I do, you're going to be amazed and then you're going to forget. I know there's going to be times you forget. Why? Because people forget. Because we're human. Because we're sinful. Because Adam and Eve in the beginning introduced sin into the world, and its effects are still felt today. And knowing that, he takes a piece of bread and he breaks it, and he says, this is my body, which I've given for you. Eat it. This is my blood, which I've poured out for you. Drink it. And then he says these words. He says, do this in remembrance of me. Do this in remembrance of me. He looks at them and he says, hey, I'm going to give you something like those 12 stones to remember me. So that when you eat this, when you drink this, remember what I did on the cross. Remember that I rose from the grave, that I proved once and for all that I could take death and sin and make it alive. That every single one of us in this room can spend eternity with God because of what Jesus did. And yet, how often do we forget that? How often do we do it our own way? We look at the Bible and we're like, I don't really need to read it. We look at youth group and we're like, I don't really need to pay attention there, or I don't really need to be a part of that. I'm just kind of doing my own thing. And that's the root of all sin, is saying, God, you're not enough. I'm going to do it my way. And he says, do this in remembrance of me. Jesus cries out to the guys that he loves that are sitting right in front of him, and he says, remember this. Remember the cross. Remember when I rise from the grave. Remember this gospel truth. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions tonight. And these are the 3 questions that you're going to talk about in hub groups, and I want you to be very, very specific in how you answer them. The first one is this. What's the one area in your life that you need the gospel to be a part of your life today? What's the one area in your life that you need to remember the gospel today? Second question is, where have you forgotten this? Or where do you consistently forget this? For me, I can highlight a couple areas in my life where I consistently forget truth. I consistently do it my own way. And when it faces the moment, when it comes down to it, more often than not, I say, I'm going to do it Austin's way, not God's way. And the last one is, what's one step that you can take this week? What's one step that you can do to remember Jesus, to remember truth? For me, one step that I took a Bible verse that I'm reading right now, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper, and I taped it on my mirror where I get ready every day. So when I brush my teeth, when I do my hair, whatever, when I look in that mirror, I remember that truth. I remember that peace. Week 1, I told you guys that what I'd been struggling with lately was waking up to read God's word. That too often I press snooze and I sleep too long and I don't wake up to dive into this truth that he has for me. And that's been something I've been challenging myself to do since then, is not pressing snooze, waking up and reading this. This week, what's one thing that you can do? What's one practical step? I think a lot of you in here want to take that step, but too often it's like, I just want to be a better Christian. And while that's all good, that's good to think about, I want to challenge you to be practical tonight, practical in the sense that this is one active step that I can take this week to remember. Write down a verse. Commit to spending time in prayer. Commit to reading your Bible. Commit to conversations about Jesus. Pope's going to come up. He's going to play a couple songs. And then what we're going to do is, after he plays those 2 songs, I'm going to come back up and dismiss you guys to hubs. But at that point, if over the next 2 songs, God's doing something in your heart, and as you're just kind of either sitting or standing, reading these words, kind of going over what we've talked about the last 3 weeks in your mind, if God's doing something in your heart, we're going to open up this room. Okay, and you have 2 options. One of those options is to go to hubs, and the other option is to stay in here. Okay? You can't stay in here for a little bit and then go to hubs. You have 30 minutes. You can do 30 minutes in hubs or 30 minutes in here. But if you're in here, I'm going to ask that you be quiet, you be respectful, and this space right here is to process if you don't want to process in hubs, and it's to kind of go through what God's doing in your life. It's not to hang out with your friends and play Uno, okay? This space right here is going to be dedicated to doing business with God. And that's what I'm going to challenge you to do over the next 2 songs. Don't distract the person next to you. Don't clap really loudly to bring attention to yourself. Okay, over the next 2 songs, spend some time focusing on God, focusing on truth. Okay, if you want to sit, you can sit. If you want to stand, you can stand.